a serial rapist strikes in a suburb outside Toronto, Canada.
The nature of the beatings, what the victims had endured, clearly told us that we're dealing with a sexually sadistic offender.
Years later, a serial killer brutally targets young girls in another Canadian town.
It was gruesome. Who could kill a young teenage girl and dismember her body?
Fear sweeps southern Ontario. The bloody trail leads police to a pair of unlikely suspects, a young, beautiful married couple.
Our battalion has distinguished itself.
The idea that these were the bad guys, that they were capable of doing anything so vile, is something that's hard for us to comprehend.
She assaulted her sister. It was absolutely mind-boggling.
It's the most sensational and probably one of the most sinister cases in Canadian history.
Saturday the 29th of June 1991, at a quiet recreational area near the town of St. Catharines in Ontario, Canada, some fishermen made a horrifying discovery. At one end of Lake Gibson, they noticed several concrete blocks partially submerged in the water. They took a closer look and were shocked to find what appeared to be pieces of human flesh protruding from the cracks. Niagara Regional Police searched the murky waters for more evidence. They found a total of 8 concrete blocks, each contained body parts.
We believe the party to be a female, young female. It could be between 14 to 24 years of age.
The victim was identified as 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey from the nearby town of Burlington. She'd been missing for 2 weeks. The same day her body was found, a young couple exchanged wedding vows 16 miles away in the quaint town of Niagara-on-the-Lake. Their fairy tale wedding was complete with a horse-drawn carriage.
At face value, it was a beautiful wedding, but if you talk to the friends and the relatives, everybody knew that it was just a big charade.
21-year-old Carla Homolka and 26-year-old Paul Bernardo appeared to be the perfect couple, but friends and family suspected Paul had been unfaithful. What they didn't know was far worse. The 16th of April 1992, less than a year after Paul and Carla's wedding, 15-year-old Kristen French went missing from her hometown of St. Catharines. 2 weeks later, on the 30th of April, her parents' worst fears were realized. A man searching for scrap metal found the body of their daughter in a ditch on the side of the road in Burlington. Kristen had been sexually assaulted, beaten and strangled. Her body was dumped less than a quarter of a mile from the cemetery where Leslie Mahaffey had been buried a year earlier. The police consulted FBI profiler Greg McCreary. They suspected there could be a connection between the two murders.
Those crimes are very unusual, to abduct and murder young women. And there was a sort of a polarization here. One was abducted in Burlington and the body was in St. Catharines. The other was abducted in St. Catharines and the body was found in Burlington. It sort of connected the crimes geographically at that point.
The location of the bodies and the viciousness of the attacks led police to suspect this was the work of an experienced killer.
This was no kid that was just starting a criminal career. This is somebody who had developed a degree of criminal sophistication over the years.
The police also believed that the culprit might have an accomplice after eyewitnesses reported seeing the victim talking to 2 people just before she disappeared.
Is this correct? Is that
what no one could imagine is that the police would eventually link the crimes to these young, good-looking newlyweds.
Our battalion has distinguished itself, but only 120 men are left.
They were attractive looking, they were intelligent, they were in love. The idea that these were the bad guys, that they were capable of doing anything so vile, is something that's hard for us to comprehend.
Paul and Carla would eventually be linked not only to the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, but also the killing of Carla's own sister and the rapes of more than a dozen other women in southern Ontario. Their story would generate headlines around the world about the systematic failure of the police to catch them and the couple's intense obsession with each other. When Carla Homolka first met Paul Bernardo, she was a 17-year-old high school student working part-time in a pet shop. Paul was 23, training to be an accountant, and would soon graduate from the University of Toronto.
Say, look, is this correct? Is that the right place?
The 17th of October, 1987, Carla was attending a pet food convention in the town of Scarborough, outside Toronto.
120 men are left out of 900.
She and a colleague were having a late-night snack in a hotel restaurant when Paul walked in.
As soon as Paul Bernardo walked in the door and laid eyes on Carla Homolka, there was, as the friends describe it, there was electricity in the air. It was love at first sight, or lust at first sight, whatever you want to call it.
Paul was over 6 feet tall with boyish good looks and a captivating charm. Carla was immediately attracted to his handsome appearance and outgoing personality. Within hours, they were in her hotel room having sex.
My sense is that Carla was extremely insecure and was looking for a strong man.
Their intense mutual attraction would eventually spiral out of control with horrific consequences.
Say, look, is this
They call it a match made in heaven, but in this case it was clearly a match made in hell.
Carla believed 23-year-old Paul was the man of her dreams, but he was a man with dark secrets, and she was a young woman who would do anything for him. The eldest of 3 daughters, Carla Homolka was a popular and pretty girl. She grew up in St. Catharines, on the southern shore of Lake Ontario. In high school, Carla had several boyfriends, but none quite like Paul Bernardo. He was 6 years her senior, and in her mind, the perfect catch. She bragged to friends about his maturity and good looks, and Paul was quite taken with Carla too.
It was a perfect match for Bernardo. He'd found his soulmate. He'd found the woman who would do anything. And ultimately she did do anything.
The youngest of 3 children, Paul was a good-looking boy with dimples and a sweet smile. But behind the happy expression was a little boy who'd had a difficult childhood. His mother was verbally abusive. His father, Paul discovered, was not his biological parent, something Paul only found out when he was 16. Around that time, Paul began peeping through his female neighbors' windows as they undressed. As he grew older, his voyeurism gradually mutated into something more aggressive.
It would appear there's something very different in terms of his sexual makeup. From what I can glean, he wasn't necessarily a man who was terribly aroused by consenting sexual activity.
Paul Bernardo tried to keep his sexual tendencies hidden. In September 1983, he began studying at the University of Toronto in Scarborough. By all accounts, he was well liked by friends and neighbors.
One of the most horrifying things is that he seems so normal. I believe that this is quite common in psychopathic personalities. They are often very charming, entertaining, life of the party kind of people.
He had several girlfriends in college who said they broke up with him when their sexual relationships became abusive.
He'd become fixated almost on violence towards women and on conquering women, on going to discos and bars and getting them and having sex with them and getting them to do whatever he wanted.
In the spring of 1988, a sexual predator was roaming the streets of Scarborough. By May, there'd been 7 attacks on women.
We're supposed to warn women not to travel alone at night.
The attacker would grab women as they got off a bus or walked through a park, pulling them behind bushes where he'd sexually assault them. At first, these attacks consisted of groping, but over a 13-month period, the assaults grew more violent. The media dubbed the attacker the Scarborough Rapist. His victims were forced to perform intercourse, oral sex and sodomy, and were sometimes beaten.
Everybody knew about the Scarborough Rapist. Everybody was on their guard. And it was a nightmare for many young women, and it was a real nightmare for the women who unfortunately happened to be pounced on by him.
The Metropolitan Toronto Police Department took statements from the victims. But they couldn't get an accurate description. The women had been attacked from behind and couldn't see the rapist's face clearly. All they could say was that he was young and good-looking with light-coloured hair. Police found another common characteristic among the attacks. The attacker forced his victims to call themselves degrading names such as slut.
Nobody had a clue who the Scarborough rapist was. The Toronto police were working diligently on the case. They'd taken as many as, I believe, 100 DNA samples from potential suspects.
In the autumn of 1988, the Toronto police called in FBI profiler Greg McCreary to assist in the search for the Scarborough rapist. Over the next several months, McCreary analysed police reports and was able to link 4 more attacks to the Scarborough rapist, bringing the total up to 11.
This was a very dangerous subtype of rapist that was very anger-based, perhaps even sadistic in nature. They're rare, but they're very, very dangerous offenders.
McCreary's concerns grew as the assaults became more serious.
Not only were these women being brutalized, but we felt we're on the verge of perhaps this thing moving over the line into homicide, and that's what had everybody's attention.
When one sees a serial rapist, there is a high probability that they're being driven by a sexual drive that's been misdirected, and that they are going to continue to be driven in that fashion unless we intervene through catching them.
Special Agent McCreary developed a profile of the person he thought police should be looking for.
We felt this was more of a high-functioning, intelligent, psychopathic, sexually sadistic sort of offender. And he lives in the Scarborough area in a dependent situation, probably with family members. Early 20s, has a violent relationship with women, even women that he's in a relationship with.
When Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka first met in the autumn of 1987, there had already been 3 attacks linked to the Scarborough rapist. Karla never suspected the man she was falling in love with was linked to these brutal crimes.
I want to go there and say, look, is this correct?
At first, Paul Bernardo showered her with flowers, with gifts, and treated her really well. He was a considerate person. He was a considerate lover. He was a nice guy. And she flaunted him something fierce.
Paul and Karla's relationship quickly intensified, both physically and emotionally. Over the next 18 months, Paul drove to St. Catharines to visit Karla several times a week, an 80-mile trip. Her family adored him and weren't concerned by their 6-year age difference. Like 19-year-old Karla, her parents thought Paul was a great catch. In the spring of 1989, Karla graduated from high school. By autumn that year, Karla was telling friends that Paul had been verbally abusing her, but she was always quick to forgive him. That December, Paul and Karla took a romantic trip to Niagara Falls. There he asked her to marry him. She eagerly accepted. To her parents, he seemed like an excellent choice of husband.
He was good looking, he had ambitions to be a rap singer. He'd been trained as an accountant, had a degree from the University of Toronto. Certainly he had all the credentials to be a dream son-in-law.
They planned to marry in the spring of 1991. On the 29th of May 1990, police released a composite sketch of the Scarborough rapist to the media.
The composite sketch came out about the time we were doing the profile. One of the victims got a pretty good look.
When the sketch was publicized, friends of Paul Bernardo were stunned by what they saw.
Paul Bernardo's best friends had in fact contacted Toronto police and said, this artist's concept is a ringer for Paul Bernardo.
During the summer of 1990, a serial rapist was terrorizing the Toronto suburb of Scarborough. Police released a composite sketch of the suspect. Metropolitan Toronto police stations were flooded with calls. The man accused of more than a dozen sexual assaults in the Scarborough area bore a strong resemblance to Paul Bernardo. By November 1990, several people, including Bernardo's own friends, had given his name to the police after seeing the composite sketch. The police brought him in for questioning and requested a DNA sample. The sample was sent to the Centre of Forensic Sciences in Toronto, where it was put on a shelf with hundreds of other samples awaiting testing.
Keep in mind that DNA still, even at that time, was relatively new. It isn't what it is today. There's all sorts of different technology today that we can get DNA readings very, very quickly.
Around